Bigfoot is living on our property. It bangs on the walls every night. That's not a figure of speech. That's exactly what started happening after we moved into the old family land in the Ozarks. Every night 3-4 in the morning something huge slammed its fists against the cabin walls until the lamps rattled and dust fell from the rafters. At first we thought it was coyotes, maybe pranksters from town. But then we found the barefoot tracks in the frost, twice the size of a man's boot, leading straight to our porch and stopping there. The dogs wouldn't leave the house. The sheriff told us it was kids messing around. But a game warden came out, heard the knocks in the trees, and left in a hurry without saying a word. So what do you do when the law won't believe you, and something out there is letting you know night after night that your home is no longer yours? It matters that you showed up today, because in every heart that still believes in wonder, compassion, and quiet strength, we find each other. I never thought I'd be sharing this story. Not like this, anyway. But when my nephew Tommy called last week, asking about the noises he remembered from his childhood visits to our place, I knew it was time. Those memories he carried weren't just the product of an overactive young mind, though I wish they were. My name is Carl Henderson, and what I'm about to tell you happened over the course of 2 years, starting back in 2008. My wife and I had just moved to my family's old property deep in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. The land had been in my family for 3 generations, originally homesteaded by my grandfather back in the 1930s. After my father passed, the property sat empty for nearly a decade while my brother and I tried to figure out what to do with it. I was 56 at the time, had just taken early retirement from my job as a structural engineer in Kansas City, and my wife and I were looking for a simpler life. The old family place seemed perfect, 140 acres of mixed hardwood forest, good well water, and enough cleared land for a decent-sized garden. The house needed work, sure, but I've always been handy with tools, and the bones of the place were solid. I should mention right up front that I'm not the type to jump at shadows or buy into tall tales. 25 years of engineering work teaches you to trust measurements, facts, and observable data. My wife likes to joke that I can take the romance out of a sunset by calculating the exact angle of the light refraction. That's probably fair. The property sits about 30 miles outside of Harrison, far enough from town that you can't see any artificial lights at night. The nearest neighbor is old Bill Whitaker, and his place is a good 3 miles down the mountain. It's the kind of quiet where you can hear a car coming from 10 minutes away, though we rarely got any traffic except the occasional lost tourist or delivery truck. When we first moved in, I spent most days working on the house, replacing rotted boards on the wraparound porch, updating the ancient wiring, and adding some modern conveniences my wife insisted on. The work was good, honest, and exactly what I'd hoped retirement would be. In the evenings, we'd sit out on that porch, watching the sun set behind the ridge line, while listening to whippoorwills call back and forth across the hollow. I remember my brother David asking if we'd be lonely out there, so isolated from everything. But it felt right to us. The property had that lived-in feeling that old family places get, like the land itself remembered the generations that had worked it. There were still apple trees my grandmother had planted, now gone wild but still producing fruit. The spring that had provided water for my father's cattle still ran clear and sweet. Looking back now, I realize how naive we were about what that isolation really meant. When you're that far out, you're not just away from people, you're deep, in something else's territory. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Tommy's call brought it all back. He's 25 now, but he couldn't have been more than 11 or 12 when he used to visit us out there. "Uncle Carl," he said, "I've been having these dreams about your place, about those nights when we'd hear those sounds in the woods. Was that real, or am I just remembering it wrong?" I sat there for a long while, phone in hand, trying to decide how to answer. How do you tell someone that their childhood fears weren't just imagination? That sometimes the things that go bump in the night are real, and they're a lot more organized and intelligent than we'd like to believe. So I'm writing this down now, partly for Tommy, but mostly because people need to know what's out there in those deep hollows of the Ozarks. What we experienced wasn't a bear, wasn't coyotes, and certainly wasn't just the wind in the trees. This is the story of how we learned that sometimes the old tales have teeth, and some territories were never really ours to begin with. Those first weeks on the property settled into a comfortable routine. Each morning I'd wake before sunrise, put on a pot of coffee, and watch the mist rise from the valley while planning out my day's work. There was always something that needed fixing. A loose board here, a leaky pipe there. The previous decade of neglect meant I had no shortage of projects to keep me busy. The land itself was a mix of what my grandfather had cleared and what nature had slowly reclaimed. The main clearing around the house was about 2 acres, with the old barn still standing proud despite its weather-beaten appearance. Beyond that, dense oak and hickory forest stretched in every direction, broken only by the winding creek that cut through the eastern edge of the property. I spent a good deal of time just walking the boundaries, reacquainting myself with places I remembered from childhood visits. The creek was deeper than I recalled, carved out by years of spring floods. It meandered north to south, creating small pools where my father used to catch catfish, about a quarter-mile upstream. The remnants of my great-uncle's farmhouse still stood, just the stone foundation and chimney now, with a few rusted pieces of farm equipment slowly sinking into the earth nearby. My wife took to gardening, starting small with some raised beds near the house. She had this knack for making things grow that I never possessed. While I wrestled with repairs, she coaxed tomatoes and peppers from the rocky soil, humming to herself as she worked. We fell into an easy rhythm, the kind you can only find when you're away from the rush of city life. The isolation didn't bother us much at first. We had satellite internet, slow but functional, and enough projects to keep us occupied. The nights were the darkest I'd ever experienced, with stars so bright you felt you could reach up and touch them. The silence took some getting used to, though. In Kansas City, there was always some background noise. Traffic, neighbors, air conditioners. Out here, when the wind died down, the quiet was absolute. It was during one of those still evenings, about 3 weeks after we'd moved in, when we first noticed something odd. We were sitting on the porch after dinner, like we usually did. The sun had just set, and that brief window of twilight was fading into true darkness. My wife was reading, and I was going over some plans for rebuilding the garden shed. The first sound was so faint I almost missed it. Just the snap of a branch at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 yards from the house. Nothing unusual about that. We often had deer come through at dusk. But then came another snap, and another, moving parallel to the clearing's edge. The movement seemed deliberate, almost like pacing. "Did you hear that?" my wife asked, lowering her book. I nodded, straining to listen. The sounds continued, methodical and unhurried. Whatever it was seemed large enough to make solid footfalls, but it wasn't crashing through the brush like a startled deer would. Just steady, measured movement, back and forth along the tree line. "Probably coyotes," I said, though it didn't sound like the way coyotes usually moved. They've been pretty active lately. My wife pulled her sweater tighter around her shoulders. It sounds bigger than a coyote. We sat there for another few minutes, listening as the sounds gradually moved further into the woods before fading entirely. The normal evening chorus of crickets and frogs, which I hadn't even noticed had gone quiet, slowly resumed. Maybe we should head in, my wife suggested, and I agreed. Though neither of us said it then, something about those footfalls had felt wrong, too regular, too purposeful. But we were still new to country living, I reasoned, still adjusting to the natural rhythms of the forest. We'd probably laugh about being spooked by a deer in the morning. The next morning, I noticed something was off with the dogs. We had two, an old black lab named Duke and a younger mixed breed. Sally, who'd followed me home one day in the city and never left. Usually, they'd spend their mornings racing around the property, checking their favorite spots and chasing squirrels. But that day, they stuck close to the porch, hackles slightly raised as they stared at the eastern tree line. I was replacing some rotted boards on the porch steps when Duke suddenly let out a low growl. Sally joined in, both dogs fixated on the same spot in the woods. I stopped hammering and looked up, expecting to see a deer or maybe that black bear the previous owner had mentioned. But there was nothing, just the usual mix of oak and hickory trees, swaying gently in the morning breeze. "What's got into you two?" I asked, but they ignored me completely. Duke's tail was stiff, and Sally's ears were pricked forward. They barked in unison, sharp and urgent, at the empty forest. I walked to the edge of the porch and scanned the tree line carefully, but still couldn't spot anything unusual. After a few minutes, they stopped barking, but refused to leave the porch. Even when my wife came out with their food bowls, they wouldn't budge from their sentinel position. She had to place the bowls right next to them, and even then, they ate quickly, heads snapping up at the slightest sound from the woods. "They're acting mighty strange today," my wife said, concern creeping into her voice. I shrugged, trying to seem casual about it. Probably caught wind of that bear, or maybe a coyote den we don't know about. But their unusual behavior continued. Throughout the day, normally they'd follow me around as I worked on various projects, but this time they wouldn't venture more than a few feet from the porch. By sunset, they were pressed against the front door, whining to be let in. Something. They rarely did unless there was a thunderstorm coming. That night felt different too. I'd gotten used to the country darkness, or so I thought, but the silence seemed heavier somehow. My wife and I were in bed, the dogs curled up unusually close to our feet when it happened. A sharp, distinct knock echoed through the quiet night. It wasn't the familiar pop of a cooling house, or a branch hitting the roof. This sound was deliberate, a single, solid knock, like someone rapping their knuckles against wood. It seemed to come from the direction of the old barn. I sat up, instantly alert. My wife's hand found my arm in the darkness. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Yeah," I replied, straining my ears for any follow-up sounds. The dogs were awake too, but strangely silent. Duke lifted his head and stared at the bedroom door, while Sally pressed herself closer to my wife's legs. We waited in the darkness for several minutes, but the knock didn't repeat. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been something falling. In the barn, maybe a loose board finally giving way, or some old tool toppling over. But even as I rationalized it, something about that sound stuck with me. It had been too precise, too intentional. I didn't mention it the next morning, but I filed it away in my mind, along with the dog's strange behavior. At the time, I told myself I was just being paranoid, still adjusting to country life. But looking back now, I realize a knock was the first real sign that something wasn't quite right on our property. The following week, I started noticing things that seemed out of place. The first was a thick branch, about as long as my forearm, carefully wedged into one of the fence posts along the eastern property line. At first glance, it looked like it might have blown there in a storm, but when I tried to pull it free, I realized someone had deliberately worked it into a gap in the wood. It took considerable effort to remove it. Could be those Henderson boys from up the road, I told my wife when she asked about it. You know how kids like to mess around. But even as I said it, something felt off. The Hendersons lived 5 miles away, and I'd never seen their children venture this far from home. A few days later, while checking the creek that ran through our property, I came across something stranger. Near the bend where the water ran deepest, someone had stacked stones into a small pyramid. These weren't just random rocks that might have fallen together naturally. These were deliberately placed, one on top of the other, with the largest stones forming a stable base. The arrangement stood about knee-high and looked recent. There was no moss growth between the stones, and the bottom rocks hadn't settled into the soil yet. Maybe it's trail markers, my wife suggested when I mentioned it over dinner, for hunters, or hikers who cut through the property. I shook my head. We're miles from any hiking trail, and hunting season's months away. Besides, I'd been around hunters all my life, and I'd never seen them mark trails like this. They typically used ribbon or spray paint on trees, things that were visible from a distance. The incidents continued. Every few days, we'd find something new, more sticks wedged into fence posts, another stone pile by the creek, and once, a series of broken branches laid out in what looked like an arrow pointing toward the old barn. Each time I tried to explain it away, teenagers, trespassers, maybe even some local trying to spook the new owners for laughs. But my wife was growing increasingly uneasy. I'd catch her staring out the windows more often, especially in the evenings. She started double-checking the locks before bed, something she'd never done before, even in the city. One morning, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, clutching her coffee mug with both hands. "I don't like this, Carl," she said quietly. "It feels like someone's watching us, testing us, maybe. Why would anyone keep coming back just to move stones around and stick branches in our fence?" I pulled up a chair beside her and tried to sound reassuring. "Look, honey, it's probably nothing serious. Could be kids with too much time on their hands, or maybe even some local who doesn't realize this property's been sold." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "If it makes you feel better, I'll put up some trail cameras next weekend. We'll catch whoever's doing this." She managed a small smile, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. Truth be told, neither was I. The persistence bothered me. These little arrangements kept appearing despite the weather, despite the distance from any main road, despite the fact that our dogs would raise hell if anyone came near the property, at least. They used to. I found myself spending more time checking the property line, looking for footprints or other signs of trespassers. But aside from our own tracks and the usual deer trails, I never found any human footprints. No cigarette butts, no candy wrappers, none of the usual trash that people tend to leave behind. Just those deliberate little signs, sticks and stones, placed with what seemed like purpose, though I couldn't begin to guess what that purpose might be. The intrusion came on a Tuesday morning, just before dawn. I remember because I'd been checking my watch at 3:30 in the morning. unable to sleep, listening to the unusual silence outside. Even the crickets had gone quiet. The first thump hit the east wall of the cabin like someone had thrown a basketball against it. My wife bolted upright beside me, her hand clutching my arm. Before either of us could speak, another impact struck the wall, heavier this time, deliberate. Then another and another, moving along the side of the house. "Carl," my wife whispered, her fingers digging into my arm. "Someone's out there." I reached for the flashlight I kept on the bedside table, my other hand already moving toward the shotgun mounted on the wall. The thumps continued, methodical, as if whatever was out there was testing the cabin's structure. Each impact seemed to carry more force than the last, and I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards. "Stay here," I told my wife, though she was already reaching for her robe. "Lock the bedroom door behind me." The living room was dark except for the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. I moved carefully, keeping close to the walls, the shotgun ready but pointed down. The thumping had moved to the back of the house now, near the kitchen. Each impact sent tremors through the walls that I could feel against my shoulder. I reached the kitchen window and peered out, using the flashlight to sweep the yard. The beam caught nothing but empty space and the edge of the woods beyond. The thumping stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my ears. That's when the smell hit me, a powerful, nauseating odor that seemed to seep through the walls themselves. It was unlike anything I'd encountered before, earthy like wet soil after rain, but mixed with something sour and pungent that reminded me of rotting vegetation and unwashed animal fur. The stench was so strong it made my eyes water. I heard my wife's muffled voice from the bedroom. "Do you see anything?" "Not yet," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. "Stay put." I debated my next move. Part of me, the practical, rational part, knew I should check outside. Whatever had been hitting the house might have left tracks or other evidence. But another part of me, a more primitive part, one rarely acknowledged, was screaming that opening that door would be a terrible mistake. The smell grew stronger, and with it came a sound, something large, moving through the undergrowth just beyond the edge of our yard. Not the crash of panicked movement, but the deliberate, careful sound of something trying to be quiet despite its size. I stood there, shotgun ready, listening to those movements circle the house. The odor followed it, intense enough to make me gag. Whatever was out there, it wasn't a bear or any other animal I knew. Bears don't move like that, don't test structures systematically, don't try to be stealthy when they're that close to humans. My pride wanted me to go outside, to confront whatever was circling our home. But something deeper, call it instinct or self-preservation, kept me rooted in place, until the sounds gradually faded into the woods, and the horrible smell began to dissipate. When dawn finally broke, I did a thorough search of the property. The morning dew had softened the ground, but I found no distinct tracks, just some disturbed earth near the walls where the impacts had occurred. There were no claw marks on the siding, no fur caught in the rough wood, nothing I could point to as definitive evidence of what had happened. I didn't call the authorities. What would I tell them? That something had knocked on our walls and left. A bad smell. That it had moved with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. They'd write it off as a bear, maybe send someone out to lecture us about securing our trash, though we kept it locked in the garage, specifically to avoid attracting wildlife. But that morning planted something in me, a deep unease that no amount of rational explanation could quite shake. Whatever had visited us wasn't finished, and some part of me knew it would be back. I threw myself into work during the daylight hours, determined to maintain normalcy. There were fences to mend, garden beds to prepare, and endless maintenance, tasks that came with rural living. Physical labor helped quiet the questions that crept in whenever I let my mind wander back to that night. Probably just a black bear, I'd tell myself, hammering another fence post into the rocky soil, getting bold because of the drought pushing them closer to settlements. The explanation sounded reasonable in the sunshine, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of birds and the distant neighbors' cattle. But the nights were different. It started with footsteps, slow, measured pacing that would begin just after sunset, sometimes near the tree line, sometimes closer to the house. My wife noticed it first, the way they'd pause whenever we made noise inside, as if whatever was out there was listening, studying our movements. "There it is again," she whispered one evening as we sat in the living room. I'd been reading, trying to ignore the soft crunch of leaves outside our window. "It's following the same pattern as yesterday." I set my book down, straining to listen. The footsteps moved with a rhythm that felt deliberate. 10 steps, pause, 10 steps, pause. Too regular for an animal foraging. Too heavy for a person trying to sneak around. "Just deer," I said, but the words felt hollow even to me. We both knew deer don't pace. My wife sat in her rocking chair, her hands still in her lap. "Carl," she said softly, "I don't think it's human." The statement hung in the air between us. I wanted to dismiss it, to offer some rational explanation. But the memory of that awful smell and those systematic thumps against our walls was still too fresh. "What makes you say that?" I asked instead. She took a deep breath, as if she'd been holding these thoughts in for a while. "The way it moves, how it reacts to us. Last night, when I got up for water, it stopped the moment my feet hit the floor, before I made any noise, like it could sense me through the walls. Outside, the pacing had stopped. The silence that followed was worse, that listening quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. And the smell," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "It comes and goes with whatever's out there. No animal I know smells quite like that." I got up and checked the locks again, though I'd already done so twice that evening. The porch light cast a weak circle of illumination that seemed to make the darkness beyond even deeper. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the shadows. Near the old oak tree, just a shift in the darkness, there and gone. "We could call the sheriff," I suggested, though I knew how it would sound. Strange noises, bad smells, a feeling of being watched, hardly enough for a formal complaint. My wife shook her head. "And tell them what? That something's been pacing outside our house, that it's too deliberate to be an animal but doesn't move like a person." She was right, of course. We had no proof, nothing concrete to report, just a growing collection of unsettling observations that seemed to mock every rational explanation I tried to force onto them. The footsteps resumed, closer now. Through the window, I could see branches moving against the wind, as if something large was brushing past them. My wife's hands gripped the arms of her rocking chair, her knuckles white in the lamplight. We sat there in tense silence, listening to whatever it was make another circuit around our home. The pattern was undeniable now, methodical, purposeful, like it was learning our habits, testing our responses, waiting for something. I kept the shotgun closer after that night, though deep down I wondered if it would make any difference, against something that seemed to understand us better than we understood it. The evening had settled into an uneasy quiet when it happened. My wife and I were in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when the first strike rang out. It wasn't just loud, it was deliberate, like someone taking a baseball bat to a hollow tree. The sound echoed through the valley, making both of us freeze in place, dish towels still in hand. 3 seconds passed. Then came the second strike, identical to the first. I found myself counting the seconds again, 1, 2, 3, before the third and final blow shattered the silence. The pattern was too precise, too measured to be random. "That's not the house settling," my wife said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was right. I'd been ready with that explanation, just like I'd been ready to call it distant gunfire or a falling branch, but there was no mistaking the intentional rhythm of those strikes. Our dogs, usually quick to bark at any disturbance, made no sound. Instead, I heard the click of their nails on the hardwood as they slunk past the kitchen doorway. Following them, I found both animals trying to wedge themselves under our bed, whimpering softly. These were working dogs, bred for courage. I'd seen them face down coyotes without flinching. But whatever made those sounds had them acting like scared puppies. "Could be someone trying to scare us," I suggested, not believing it even as I said it. The strikes had been too powerful, too deep in tone to be human-made. They reminded me of the way sound carries across water on a still night, pure and resonant. My wife stood in the bedroom doorway, arms crossed tight against her chest. "Listen," she said. I did. The normal nighttime sounds had vanished. No crickets, no distant owls, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. Then it came again, 3 more strikes, this time from a different direction. The sequence was identical. Strike, 3 seconds, strike, 3 seconds, strike. The dogs pushed themselves further under the bed, their whimpers turning to low moans. "That's not an echo," I said, stating the obvious. The sound had moved, as if whatever was making it had circled partway around our property. The new location put it closer to the creek, maybe 400 yards from the first set of knocks. My wife moved closer to me, her hand finding mine in the growing darkness. "It's answering itself," she said. "Or there's more than one." The thought sent a chill down my spine. I'd heard about this wood knocking, they called it in some of the old stories. Hunters and campers had reported similar sounds in remote areas, always with the same precision, always in sets of 3. But hearing it yourself, watching your dogs hide from it, feeling the absolute stillness that followed each series of knocks that was different from any campfire tale. We waited, barely breathing, for several minutes. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional whimper from under the bed. Just when I thought it might be over, 3 more strikes rang out from yet another location, completing a rough triangle around our property. Same pattern, same timing, same resonant tone that seemed to bypass your ears and vibrate directly in your chest. "Carl," my wife said, her grip tightening on my hand. "Whatever's doing that, it's talking. They're talking to each other." I couldn't deny it anymore. The precision, the deliberate positioning, the way each series answered the last. This wasn't random animal activity or natural sounds. This was communication. Something intelligent was out there in the darkness, coordinating its movements around our home. The dogs had gone silent now, pressed so far under the bed I could barely see them. The night pressed against our windows, and I found myself straining to hear any movement, any hint of what might come next. The next morning dawned bitter cold, with frost coating every surface like powdered sugar. I stepped out onto the porch, coffee mug warming my hands, and that's when I saw them. At first, my mind couldn't process what I was looking at: dark depressions in the crystalline frost, leading in a straight line toward our porch. My coffee mug nearly slipped from my grip as I set it down on the railing. These weren't deer tracks, weren't bear prints, weren't anything I'd seen in 40 years of outdoor experience. They were footprints, human-like footprints, but so massive it made my throat go dry. I descended the porch steps, following the trail. Each print was pressed deep into the ground, the frost outlining them in stark detail. They came straight out of the tree line, no hesitation or meandering, directly toward our house. About 15 feet from the porch, they turned abruptly and headed back into the woods. My hands were shaking as I planted my own boot next to one of the prints. I wear a size 11, and I'm not a small man, but my foot looked like a child's beside this impression. It was nearly twice the length of my boot, and proportionally wider. 5 distinct toe impressions were clearly visible in the frost spread wide, as if whatever made them walked barefoot through the freezing night. "Martha," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Could you bring me the measuring tape from the kitchen drawer?" My wife appeared at the door, and I saw her face go pale as she took in what I was looking at. She disappeared back inside, and returned with the tape measure, her hands clutching her robe tight around her throat. I knelt down, ignoring the cold seeping through my jeans, and carefully extended the tape. 18.5 inches, from heel to toe. The width at the ball of the foot was just over 8 inches. The depth of the impression, even in our hard-packed soil, was nearly 2 inches. "What kind of person?" my wife started, then stopped herself. We both knew these weren't human tracks. No person could leave prints this size, this deep, walking barefoot in near-freezing temperatures. I traced the outline with my finger, noting the anatomical details preserved in the frost. The arch of the foot was pronounced, the toe impressions clearly defined. This wasn't some crude hoax or misidentified animal track. Whatever had made these prints had a foot structured remarkably like a human's, just on an impossible scale. "The knocking last night," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It came right up here while we were sleeping." My wife's hand found my shoulder, gripping tight. "Carl, we need to call someone." I nodded, still staring at the prints. All my rational explanations, all my dismissals of the strange events of the past weeks, were crumbling in the face of this evidence. Something extraordinary was happening on our property, something I couldn't explain away with talk of coyotes or trespassing. Hunters, the morning sun was rising higher, and I could see the frost beginning to melt. Soon, these incredible prints would be gone, leaving us with nothing but our memories and the unsettling knowledge that something massive, something that walked on 2 legs, had stood mere feet from our home while we slept. I took out my phone and started taking pictures, trying to capture the scale by placing my boot in frame. But I already knew the photos wouldn't do justice to what we were seeing. They wouldn't convey the depth, the perfect clarity of the anatomical details, or the bone-deep certainty that we were looking at something beyond ordinary explanation. "We should go inside," my wife said softly, tugging at my sleeve. "Please." "Carl," I let her pull me to my feet, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from those tracks. The woods beyond seemed darker somehow, deeper, as if they were hiding something that had just stepped back behind the curtain of trees, waiting to see what we would do next. After documenting the tracks as best I could, I finally made the call. I'd been avoiding My fingers felt numb as I dialed the county sheriff's office, and not just from the morning cold. "Sheriff's Department," a gruff voice answered. I cleared my throat. "This is Carl Matheson, out on Old Creek Road. I need to report some unusual activity on my property." "Go ahead, Mr. Matheson." I described the past week's events, trying to stick to the facts: the knocking, the pacing at night, and now these massive footprints. I emphasized my background in hunting and tracking, making sure they understood I wasn't some city transplant jumping at shadows. Sheriff Roberts arrived about an hour later, his patrol truck crunching up our gravel drive. By then, the sun had risen higher, and the frost was mostly gone. The prints were still visible, but they'd lost that crystal-clear definition that had made them so striking at dawn. The sheriff, a weathered man in his 60s, followed me too, the tracks with the weary expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. He squatted down, squinting at the impressions in the dirt. "Probably kids," he said, barely glancing at them. "Get a lot of pranksters out here, especially this time of year. Might be wearing those big costume feet you can buy online." "Sheriff," I said, working to keep my voice level. I measured these prints. They're 18.5 inches long. The impression is nearly 2 inches deep in hard soil. And look at the anatomical detail. He held up a hand, cutting me off. "Mr. Matheson, I appreciate you being thorough, but I've been sheriff in this county for 23 years. Never found anything that couldn't be explained by either people or regular wildlife. Now, if you're having trouble with trespassers, we can increase patrols in the area." I could feel my frustration building. "These aren't costume feet, Sheriff. Whatever made these tracks walked barefoot in near-freezing temperatures." "Well," he drawled, standing up with a slight grunt, "if you see any actual trespassers, or if there's any property damage, give us a call." He turned toward his truck, then paused. "Might want to set up some trail cameras. Catch your pranksters in the act." As the sheriff headed back to his vehicle, his young deputy lingered behind. The deputy, who couldn't have been more than 30, kept glancing between me and his departing boss. "Mr. Matheson," he said quietly, once the sheriff was out of earshot, "you're not the only one who's called about strange things lately." I turned to face him fully. "What do you mean?" The deputy cleared his throat nervously. "Couple of farmers out near Miller's Creek reported prowlers last month. Said they were too big to be normal people. One of them mentioned tracks, but," he glanced over his shoulder again, "we're not supposed to talk about it. Sharif doesn't want people getting worked up. Have you seen anything yourself?" I asked. He shifted his weight uncomfortably. "No, sir, not directly, but I've been on night patrol when," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "when things got real quiet, unnatural quiet, and there was this smell, like something earthy and sour." I prompted. His eyes widened slightly, but before he could respond, the sheriff's voice boomed from the truck. "Jenkins, we've got other calls waiting." The deputy straightened up. "Sorry, sir, I should go. Just maybe keep this between us." He hurried off toward the patrol vehicle, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. I watched them drive away, feeling more isolated than ever. The sheriff's dismissal wasn't surprising, but the deputy's whispered confirmation of other reports left me deeply unsettled. Something was happening out here in these hills, something the authorities either couldn't or wouldn't address. My wife was waiting on the porch when I walked back. "What did they say?" "Sheriff thinks it's pranksters," I replied, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "Suggested we set up trail cameras." She wrapped her arms around herself, staring out at the tree line. And you believe that? I thought about the deputy's nervous confession, about the other farmers with their unnamed prowlers. No, I said finally. No, I don't. The next morning, a state conservation officer pulled into our driveway in his green department truck. I'd been splitting wood near the shed and watched him make his methodical approach, clipboard in hand. His crisp uniform and official demeanor suggested this was more than a casual visit. Good morning, he called out, adjusting his wide-brimmed hat. I'm Officer Davidson from the Department of Conservation. We received a report about some unusual wildlife activity in the area. I set my maul against the chopping block. That was quick. I only spoke to the sheriff yesterday. We try to follow up on these matters promptly, he replied, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. Mind if we take a look at where you found those tracks? I led him to the area near the porch where the footprints had been. Though mostly faded now, you could still make out the deeper impressions in places. Officer Davidson knelt down, producing a small measuring tape from his pocket. Lot of black bears in these parts, he said matter-of-factly. They'll sometimes stand on their hind legs, leave marks that can look mighty peculiar to folks who aren't familiar. I've tracked bear before, I countered. These weren't bear tracks. They had distinct toes, a pronounced arch. Mr. Matheson, he interrupted, standing up and brushing off his knees. I've been working these woods for 15 years. What we typically find in these cases is either known wildlife or human activity. Now, about these knocking sounds you reported. Before he could finish, 3 sharp cracks echoed through the trees. They came from the direction of the creek, each knock distinct and purposeful, spaced exactly like someone sending a signal. Officer Davidson went rigid. I watched his hand instinctively move toward his sidearm, then drop away. The confident authority drained from his face, replaced by something I recognized, the look of a man confronting something he'd hoped never to encounter again. That's them, I said quietly. The knocks we've been hearing. He was already backing toward his truck. Probably woodpeckers. Pileated woodpeckers are common in these parts. They can sound louder than you'd expect. Those weren't woodpeckers, I pressed. You know they weren't. He gathered his clipboard and quickened his pace. I need to wrap this up. I've got other calls to make today. Officer Davidson, I called after him. What aren't you telling me? He paused at his truck door, his knuckles white on the handle. For a moment, I thought he might say something meaningful. Instead, he cleared his throat and adopted his official tone again. If you continue to have concerns, you can file a formal report through our website. Good day, Mr. Matheson. I watched him drive away far faster than he'd arrived, gravel spraying from his tires. My wife had come out onto the porch during the exchange, and now she joined me in the yard. He knows something, she said softly. I nodded. Did you see how he reacted to those knocks? That wasn't surprise, that was recognition. Why wouldn't he tell us what's really going on? I thought about the deputy's nervous confession and now the conservation officer's hasty retreat, because whatever it is, they don't have an official way to deal with it, or maybe they're not allowed to acknowledge it at all. We stood there, listening to the woods, but the knocks didn't repeat. The morning had gone quiet again, that strange, heavy silence that seemed to press in around us. Somewhere out there, something was watching, something the authorities knew about but wouldn't tour. COULDN, single quotes, T-. Discuss. My heart wasn't in the wood splitting anymore. The conservation officer's reaction had confirmed what I'd been suspecting. We weren't dealing with bears, pranksters, or any other easy explanation. And we weren't the only ones who knew it. As winter settled over the Ozarks, the nights grew longer and darker, and whatever had been watching us grew bolder. The occasional disturbances of autumn transformed into nightly visitations that left both my wife and me exhausted and on edge. It started with the thump snot, the sharp, communicative knocks we'd heard before, but heavy, deliberate impacts against our cabin's outer walls. They would begin around midnight, working their way around the perimeter as if something massive was testing our defenses. "There it goes again," my wife whispered one night in December, clutching my arm as another thud resonated through our bedroom wall. The windows rattled in their frames, and our dogs, who now refused to sleep anywhere but under our bed, whimpered softly. I'd started keeping a tape recorder running each night, setting it on the windowsill where the activity seemed most frequent. The next morning, I would listen to hours of recorded darkness. Most of it was silence and wind. But sometimes I caught something that made my skin crawl. On one recording, beneath the sound of rattling windows, there was a deep, gut vocalization that couldn't have come from any animal I knew. It wasn't a growl or a howl, but something in between, carrying undertones that seemed almost speech-like. We took to sleeping with every light in the house on, burning through electricity like never before. The power bill doubled, but neither of us suggested turning them off. The lights became our shield, however thin, against whatever circled our home in the dark. "It's getting closer," my wife said one morning, dark circles under her eyes from another sleepless night. At first, it stayed in the tree line. Now, it's right up against the house. She was right. I could trace its path each morning, massive. Footprints in the frost, leading right up to our windows. Sometimes we'd find scratch marks on the siding, far higher than any bear could reach. The tape recorder captured the sound of heavy breathing, branches snapping under tremendous weight, and occasionally what seemed like attempts at mimicking our own voices. The dogs wouldn't go outside after sunset anymore, even during daylight. They stayed close to the house, their eyes constantly scanning the woods. Their behavior had changed from alert watchfulness to complete submission, tails tucked, heads low, as if they knew they were no match for whatever shared our land. One particularly bad night, the circling went on for hours. The tape recorder picked up the sound of something dragging along the walls, punctuated by those awful, almost human vocalizations. My wife and I sat up in bed, every light blazing, listening to it test each window, each door, methodically working its way around our home. "Carl," she whispered, though we were alone in the room, "what if the lights go out?" I had no answer for her. We both knew our illuminated sanctuary was fragile, dependent on power lines that stretched through miles of dark forest. Each night, we prayed the lights would hold, knowing that whatever was out there was growing more persistent, more curious, more bold. The morning after another restless night, I walked out to check on the barn and stopped cold. Something had woven young saplings into a crude lean-to structure against the barn's eastern wall. The branches were bent and twisted with deliberate precision, too high for a person to reach without a ladder. My hands shook as I took photos with the disposable camera I'd started carrying. That was just the beginning. Later that afternoon, I found a complex arrangement of branches on our front porch, carefully stacked in a pattern that seemed almost ceremonial. The wood wasn't from our immediate area. Some pieces had been carried from deeper in the forest. The stone circles were the final straw. I discovered 3 of them near the creek, perfectly arranged in ascending sizes. These weren't the work of local kids or pranksters. The largest stones would have taken considerable strength to move. That evening, my wife's hands trembled as she poured her coffee. "Carl," she said softly, "it's claiming the land. This isn't just passing through anymore." She paused, gathering courage. Maybe we should consider selling before it gets worse." I couldn't disagree. The evidence was mounting that we weren't dealing with a transient visitor, but something that considered our property its territory. The storm hit 3 nights later. Thunder rolled across the hills as rain lashed against our windows. My wife and I were huddled in the living room when the first impact struck her. Tremendous blow that rattled the entire cabin. Dust sifted down from the ceiling beams as another crash shook the western wall. I gripped my 12-gauge shotgun, its familiar weight offering little comfort as the assault continued. The cabin groaned under the barrage, each hit powerful enough to make the windows vibrate in their frames. My wife clutched my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the yard through our picture window. For a split second, I saw it, a massive silhouette moving with frightening speed across our property. The figure was impossibly tall, its shoulders broad and hunched, disappearing into the tree line before the darkness returned. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely keep hold of the shotgun. For the first time, I truly understood we were dealing with something beyond my capacity to defend against. The next morning, we didn't even discuss it. My wife silently began packing our essentials while I called her sister in Springfield. I told them the storm had damaged the cabin's roof and we needed a place to stay temporarily. The lie felt hollow in my throat, but it was easier than explaining. The truth, as we loaded the car, I felt the weight of defeat pressing down on me. This land had been in my family for generations, and here I was, running from something I couldn't even properly name. But watching my wife's hands shake as she gathered her belongings, I knew we had no choice. Her safety meant more than my pride or any piece of property. We left before noon, the cabin growing smaller in my rearview mirror. The structures near the barn that twisted lean-to of branches seemed to mock our retreat. That was 5 years ago now. Last summer, I drove past the old property, couldn't help myself. Those structures we found, the lean-to in stone circles, they were still there, weathered but intact. No animals had disturbed them. No storms had scattered them. The new owners lasted 8 months before they left too. They never said why, but the neighbors told me about the pounding sounds that followed their arrival, just like before. No one's been able to prove what caused it all. I'm telling you this as a warning. When something like that marks your home as its territory, it never truly lets you go. Even now, hundreds of miles away, I sometimes wake to that familiar 3-knot pattern in the night. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story left even the smallest echo within you, consider subscribing. I'll meet you here again tomorrow with another tale that speaks softly to the soul.